I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Liz Moore. Oh man, you guys have been reading Liz Moore as long as I've been reading Liz Moore, right? And we're going back before Long Bright River, which we are going to hit up, but okay, God of the Woods. How many of you have read God of the Woods already? Okay, right. And you read it in a single sitting, and you did not want to talk to anyone, and the dishes did not get done, and maybe you didn't take out the garbage, right? Yeah. I love this book. I really love this book. It is also our new Barnes & Noble Book Club pick. But we are going to be spoiler-free in this conversation. If you want the spoiler part, you can join us in August. And there's a whole different event for that. But I'm so excited that you and I get to hang out.
Me
I have
too.
so many questions. Starting with 1975. Mm-hmm. That feels like a really smart, deliberate, we can't have cell phones or the internet and everyone has to do research the old-fashioned way. But 1970, were you even alive in 1975?
I wasn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 1975, why?
There are so many reasons. Okay, first is there are a couple of actual historical events that the book is tethered to. And one is there is a real serial killer upon whom one side character is based. And that serial killer's name is Robert Garrow. And Robert Garrow, the actual guy, was active in the Adirondacks during the 1970s. Right. Okay. And so there was this kind of real reference point and also the atmospheric quality of, yes, having a lack of technology, having newspapers be a thing, the sort of the fact that kids in particular wouldn't have been accustomed to looking down all the time on screens and instead would have to face one another. Those were all kind of calculations that I made.
I want to talk about the Adirondacks for a second because we cannot separate any of this story from that. I actually don't think this would work in the same way if you put it in camp in Maine.
Yeah.
Or Michigan or Minnesota. It really, the Adirondacks sort of has this legendary status for lots of different reasons, but I want to talk about your connection to the Adirondacks, but also why you had to set this book there.
Yeah, okay, so my connection to the Adirondacks is that my maternal ancestors, 4 of my maternal ancestors, moved to the southern Adirondacks in the early 1800s, purportedly to start family farms. At that time, the state of New York was attempting to draw population westward from New England and northward from New York City to populate the state. And they did so by promising that there was fertile agricultural land. So I have no strong evidence that my own ancestors fell for that, but it seems likely that they did since they moved there to start farms. It also seems likely that they were not successful in those in that endeavor because by the 1900s, early 1900s, they had settled just south of there, which is where my grandmother was born and raised and my mother was raised. Okay. We still go back to the Adirondacks because my grandparents built a cabin in the woods of the southern Adirondacks that is still in our family, and we still go there, and I bring my kids there, and it's a very important place emotionally to us. And so, why did I set the book there? That's my personal connection to it. I set it there because I have such strong sense memories of the place, and I've never yet written a book set in a place I haven't really lived or spent a huge number of hours in. And this was no different. I felt strongly that I could capture the essence of the place with all 5 senses. And so, it had to be. I don't know anything about Maine. And so I had to set it in the Adirondacks because I know at least a little bit about the Adirondacks.
Wait, is it Teddy Roosevelt who sort of got the Adirondacks rolling as we know them as a national park? He's really behind that, right?
He was a big proponent of conservation, obviously, and famously, Teddy Roosevelt had to ride from the top of a mountain in the Adirondacks, maybe Mount Marcy, upon learning that he had to step into the role of president, or was about to have to step into the role of president due to the injury of the existing president. And so he famously rode on horseback for 4 days only to find out that the president who had been injured was actually going to survive. And so he returned to the Adirondacks. But he was one of the prominent American voices making a strong case for the conservation of the land, along with other dynastic American families like the Vanderbilts and eventually the Rockefellers, although they came later. And, wealthy people discovered the Adirondacks, and then conservation became a thing.
So we're talking 1900s, right?
I think it was 1892,
Okay,
maybe, that the
okay.
governor of New York declared that the Adirondack Park Preserve would exist and be protected. Roswell P. Flower. I think I got the year wrong. Now I became self-conscious because this is being taped.
Well, but we have Google.
Late 1800s.
It's okay. And also
Last decade of the
we have an essay in the back of our edition, too.
Yeah, that's right.
That
just by
does
the
actually have dates in it, because I read it this morning. I can promise you everything you need is there. But that brings us to your dynastic family, the von Laars. Peters 1 through 4. There's a map in the opening of the book, right? So you've got the layout of the summer camp. You've got the layout of the preserve, the woods, right? And they go and they go and they go and they go. And then you've got this house called Self-Reliance, which I am trying not to laugh too hard at, because I think the Van Laars aren't... They have a family mythology that they like to hold on to.
They do.
Let's talk about the Van Laars for a second.
Sure. Okay. So the premise of the book is available inside the jacket, but I'll just briefly recap it for anybody who might not have had a chance to look at the inside of the jacket. The God of the Woods is the story of the Van Laar family. They are a wealthy, dynastic American family of bankers from Albany. In 1961, their son Bear goes missing in the wilderness of this preserve, this home that they've built in the wilderness, this mansion that they've named Self-Reliance. They have a child, Barbara, and I'm not spoiling anything, I promise.
No.
Sort of in their grief over the disappearance of their son. Barbara is very much an outsider in her own family. She begs to go to the summer camp that the family has founded on the same grounds just down the hill. In 1975, her parents finally relent and let her go, but by the end of the summer, she too has disappeared. She's disappeared from the camp. And so the central question of the book is, what happened to both children? Is it the same force that caused them both to disappear? Is it two different forces? Could the locals in the working class community nearby have had something to do with it? Could the family themselves have had something to do with it? And so there's also this kind of like upstairs, downstairs thing going on within this cast of characters. I think the Van Laars, you put it as very well, which is that they've created their own mythology, this mythology around their own family, beginning with naming their house Self-Reliance, which is kind of a testament to the idea that they believe that everything that has come to them, they deserve. And you can sort of interpret that in two different ways. The locals joke that the fact that they've named the house Self-Reliance ignores the idea that it was really the local community that built the entire preserve, that constructed the house from a disassembled mansion from Switzerland, who now staff the house. So certainly the Van Laars believe themselves to be entirely self-reliant, but they are in no way self-reliant. They really have built their entire estate on the backs of the working class community nearby.
The women, the girls and the women, because there's a kid called Tracy who's 12 who I got very attached to, and Barbara who's 13 who I also got very attached to. And then their counselor Louise, who's from Shattuck, the town just over. And then we've got Judy, who is one of the first female state troopers in New York, which, not a small thing, if you think about 1975 being what it is, right? And then I'm going to pull in Alice, who is Barbara's mother. I want to talk about these women sort of in a cluster because they're all so interesting to me. The adolescents are truly adolescent and sound like adolescents, which is not necessarily an easy trick to pull off on the page, right? Like we've all had moments in books where we're like, oh, that 12-year-old sounds like she's 50. Cool. Alice is kind of tragic. My first thought was, wow, she's a drug addict. And then you hit me with this line where she's like, I was never smart. I was never taught that I was smart. I didn't go to college. Everyone around me is smart. And I'm like, oh, no. Now I'm going to be fond of Alice, too. And Judy making her way in the world. And Louise keeps making bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. So can we talk about the structure of these women? I mean, obviously, they all fill a role in the story, but they're so distinct. And I'm kind of curious to know who showed up first.
So I wrote a short story set in a contemporary summer camp in which there was a character very much like Tracy, and that was over a decade ago. An outsider who never really fit in, who felt very self-conscious, who entered a camp to which the other children had been going for years. And so in one way, she was sort of the first character I ever created. But when it came time to decide whether I could write a novel set at a similar summer camp, Louise was the one who came to me first, because Louise is the counselor, and she opens the book too. And it's all third person perspective, but we're in a very close third point of view on Louise at the start of the novel. And I liked Louise because she straddles both worlds. And so she can offer a sort of access point for readers into the world of the camp. She grew up working class in Shattuck, but she was sort of like the prize of her hometown. And she went to college for a year where she met this wealthy young man who happens to be the godson of the Van Laars. And so he's able to set her up with a job as a counselor, which is a role that's typically reserved for the children of the wealthy.
Right.
And so she's stuck in this terrifying moment where she realizes that the daughter of the family who employs her has gone missing on her watch, and everything hangs in the balance for her, because without this job, you know, she will not have the income that she needs to support her mother and her younger brother. But also, you know, if her reputation is ruined, she might not get work again. And so much is at stake for her. And that's always, you know, those are the characters that I really feel can move a story forward when the stakes are clear right from the beginning. So, but you're right, in a general sense, I was interested in this novel. And you asked at the very start, why did you set it in 1975? I think it was sort of a turning point where women's rights were were sort of at the forefront of the national discourse, and yet women were so limited across multiple axes of society, including even a character like Alice, who's in many, many ways very privileged because she's the wife of the youngest or the second youngest Peter Van Laar, and in many ways a terrible person. She treats her staff deplorably, but yet she was born into a role that she wanted no part of and that she really has a hard time escaping. And so there is a kind of, I think there's maybe a reluctant sympathy that forms for her over the course of the novel. Maybe. I don't know.
But here's the thing. But if she had a department store credit card, whatever the department store in Albany was in 1975, if she had a credit card, it would say Mrs. Peter Van Laar on it. It would not even, she couldn't even use her own name.
Right. Yeah.
Like she couldn't have a bank. Well, maybe she could have had a bank account, but her husband's a banker. He's not opening a bank account for her.
Yeah.
She has no agency, and unlike someone, say, Louise or Judy, isn't really trying to find it either.
Right. Yeah. No, she's very stripped of agency and to her own detriment.
Yet, you made me feel a little bit of empathy for her, because really her backstory was just, and you guys can find it out for your own selves if you haven't read it yet. I still had a lot of concern for her, despite the fact that I was like, oh man, I'm not going to let...
I felt the same way over the course of writing.
This brings me to my next question. I know you don't outline. You've got a really big cast. Never mind the multiple Peters. You have
so many
big
Peters.
Cast. You've got a big space that you're filling. We do jump in time. We jump back to the 50s. We jump back to the 60s. I love the way it's set up. When you see the chapter headings, you'll see how it breaks out. And it's just like, okay, all right. I mean, I have a little bit of a guidebook here. But structuring a story like this, and we will come back to the literary mystery part, and we're going to do this part first. Structuring your cast, place is the thing that drives it. You know you need more than just people sitting around talking.
Yeah.
But structuring this so you keep the momentum going.
Yeah, so I don't ever outline in advance. I do keep a running chronology as I write in a separate Word document. So every time I name a date, I sort of add it to the running list that I have to keep my own mind straight. So that and also so I can quickly reference, like, when did that thing happen? Oh, that's when it happened. The header at the start of every chapter was very much a collaborative process between me and my editor, Sarah, who is over there, because it is a lot to keep track of for the reader. And so having a kind of guidepost at the start of each chapter with not just the year or the month, but also where we have been and where we are going, felt like a helpful hand to the reader. But overall, I think not outlining for me allows me to make discoveries that hopefully result in the feeling of surprise also for the reader, even if it means I have to go back and retrofit or revise things that I've already written.
So a little bit like Dennis Lehane in what he's doing in Mystic River or Small Mercies or anything by Tana French, right? There's a little bit, there's not just the mystery, but I think we're now calling it literary mystery because, you know, we like to put labels on things. But I love the form for you and the kind of storytelling that you do. And it's like watching, because, I mean, I have been reading, was Heft the first book?
I had a very small publication called The Words of Every Song, which was interconnected short stories about the music industry.
Okay, so Heft was the first novel of yours that I read, and then Unseen World, your Boston book, which makes me laugh. But it feels like you really found your footing with Long Bright River, and this is not dissimilar in structure.
Yeah.
Is writing a mystery, is that where you get the real engine of the story? Because I feel like you're still very grounded in character.
Yeah, I've become more and more interested in mystery, overt mystery, as I've written. But actually, I think all the way back to a book like Heft, it too had a mystery of paternity, for example.
Right.
And then The Unseen World is sometimes labeled speculative fiction or whatever. But it had a mystery of like invented identity. And so I guess in a way, every novel I've written has a sort of mystery at the heart. And it's really how they are marketed that has changed over the years. Yeah.
So you seem to have turned expectations of the suspense novel upside down. You're training your readers, for lack of a better term, to look for explanations rather than simply for perpetual logic. And oftentimes in that explanation we find great humanity. Is this an intentional move on your part to avoid oversimplification, to introduce a wrinkle into the suspense genre, or is it just a reflection of your menschiness?
Oh, I feel like I know who in this room wrote that question, but I'm not going to make guesses out loud. I'll save it for after. Yeah, that's a great word, explanation. Yeah, I am interested, I guess, in not just, I think motive is another way to put that. Like, not just who did it and how did they do it and when did they do it, but also why did they do it. That's as important to me as anything else. And I think trying as much as possible not to be reductive about the morality of characters is another thing that I do, although I do take great satisfaction every now and then in just writing like a pure villain. And I think I'm letting myself do that more and more, maybe as I lean into genre, as I continue to write novels. Like there's a real bad guy in Long Bright River, and there's a pretty like unredeemable few characters in The God of the Woods, and sometimes it's just fun to write villains.
There are a couple of people I would have punted into the sun.
Yeah.
I would have been perfectly happy to punt them into
or the
sun.
lake.
Well, yes, the lake. I mean, we'll take what we can get. But coming back to Long Bright River for a second, Judy, who is the detective working for the New York State Police, she is a big part of the latter section of the book. Like, you really spend a lot of time establishing town versus gown, all of those social divides, the parties, the ickiness of the Van Laars, how they got where they are, kind of thing. Mickey, if I remember correctly, showed up pretty early. Wasn't she the first character that sort of kicked off Long Bright River for you? Okay. So let's talk about Judy's origins for a second. I mean, she serves more than just a narrative purpose, but she's quite a groovy character.
Thanks. Yeah. So yes, Long Bright River is narrated, has a first-person narrator, which makes it different than The God of the Woods. Mickey is a patrol cop, and she narrates the entire novel of Long Bright River. Judy is not a patrol cop. She's the part of the first crop of female investigators in the state of New York. And I keep returning to your very first question, which is why 1975. I read an article about the actual first crop of female investigators to graduate at Albany, and they happened to be the first state police investigators also in the nation. And so that captured my imagination immediately. I saw a picture of some of them graduating on a stage, and I believe the year was earlier in the 1970s, which makes sense because now it's 1975, whatever. But yeah, Judy is, when I entered the world of The God of the Woods, I entered through all the other characters first. And then in writing it, I discovered that it's really hard to write a mystery that includes a crime without having any law enforcement perspective,
Right.
because you bump up against a lot of walls. And so Judy enters, I don't know, maybe a third of the way through the book, maybe a little sooner than that. But she quickly became much more than just a vehicle of information for me. And she ends up, in some ways, having a really strong, important voice at the end of the novel as well, which I can't talk about because of spoilers. But yeah, she grew on me a lot as a character as I wrote her.
I mean, I feel like you've got sort of Alice and Barbara and that sort of segment, and some of the other counselors and whatnot. There's that sort of segment of the women. Then you've got Louise and her story and her peer group. And then Judy she's got more mobility ultimately than Louise will have. But there's this whole, like, I have to live at home with my parents. My dad's not going to let me move out until I'm married.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of 1975, and it's wild because it really wasn't that long ago.
No. Yeah. No, I have used this analogy one other time, but I liked it, so I'm going to use it again. I started thinking of all the different characters in this ensemble as chess pieces, and like they can only move in certain ways, but Judy ended up being kind of like the queen, and like she could move in almost every way, and so she was able to make discoveries that the other characters couldn't. And maybe Alice was the rook, like she could only move in a very limited way, or maybe a pawn is better. Sorry, I'm going to stop now, but that's, I did start to think of them as having certain moves that they could make as I wrote the book.
Okay, so chess is not my game.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bring this down a notch for a second. But I mean, when I think about Tracy, right, like here she is, this middle-class kid, but her dad comes out of the horse racing business, and her parents are divorced, and her dad has a new girlfriend, and she's sort of figuring out what that means. And so she's got that orbit, and then you've got certainly Barbara's orbit and how that's going to overlap with Tracy, and lest I forget TJ, who is the head of the camp but has grown up on the estate and has known these people forever. Like all of these intersecting orbits, right? And the way you handle, there's so much nuance to everyone's class story. And even the von Laars, I mean, they have sort of rules for engagement even for the people who show up in their orbit, right? Like I'm going to use Alice's sister, Delphine, as an example, because Delphine's husband is like, I don't want to be a banker. I'm going to go study ornithology. And everyone's like, well, you can't do that. And he's like, well, actually I can because I have the money to pay for it. So bye. All of these little things. You spent a lot of time thinking about details that other people might have been like,
I love Edith Wharton, and I love, you're like, say no more. That's the answer to that question.
No,
but I do love how in Wharton novels, there are such fine nuances of old money. There's the wealthy, there's the not wealthy, there's the wealthy, and then within the wealthy, there are people who have newly acquired wealth, who have a ton of wealth, and who have old, long-standing wealth. And everybody's allowed a different level of eccentricity.
Right.
And that is true in the case of Delphine and her husband, for example. Like, they're allowed eccentricity because they, in theory, like, don't pose a threat to anybody else. They're just like the weird relatives who come in and they're kind of like mascots, and they do their thing and they're sort of laughed about, but also respected. And so that kind of nuance is very intriguing to me as a writer. And
it's fun to read. It is really, really fun to read, but sometimes I feel like it has to happen in a moment where tech isn't driving the story, right? Like it's so easy. And yeah, social media, but it's easy to sort of fake the images that go with certain things, and the nuance is totally lost in it, and you kind of have to be in the same space in order to understand who's sort of running the show, like where the actual money is and where the power is. Like it's not just, you can have an old name, but if there's no money there, right? And the Van Laars obviously are not those people. But class too, I mean, if we're talking about the opioid crisis, right? Like that's a great example in Long Bright River of how we talk about class without talking about class, right? Like, who do we talk about when we're talking about rehab, and who do we talk about when we're talking about incarceration, right? And it intersects along race, but also class, right? Like the Kensington neighborhood is kind of the smack opposite of the preserve.
Yeah, Kensington is at this point very working class, very underserved in a lot of ways, but it has a long history as a very middle class community within Philadelphia, and so there's traces of that still. It also is at the intersection of a ton of gentrification that's happening in Philadelphia, and so lots and lots of developers are now encroaching upon Kensington and attempting, for example, to like build a condo where a free healthcare clinic is, and so taking away even more of the important organizations that serve the community. I will say with a subject like addiction, one of the things I like to think about with addiction is how it too cuts across all classes. And so there's a character like Alice who is herself struggling with addiction.
Oh, yes.
As a wealthy woman who is incredibly limited in a lot of ways. One of my favorite organizations in Kensington is called Savage Sisters, and the founder of it, Sarah Laurel, does a wonderful job she lives in Kensington, works in Kensington, very boots on the ground. And she likes to remind people constantly that the people who are suffering from substance use disorder in the neighborhood are largely kids who come in from the counties, meaning the main line, Bucks County. Like, they are the children, they are not children from the neighborhood. They are the children of the wealthy who come in, or the middle class. And so when she's making appeals to people on social media or at fundraisers or otherwise, she's very quick to remind people, like, this is not a not in my backyard problem. Like, this is a problem that the suburbs bring into the city, not vice versa.
So how do you know which ideas to follow?
If I can't stop reading about a thing or thinking about a thing, typically that's probably a novel idea. I've certainly had false starts on novels where I go down a rabbit hole and I read and read and read.
Right.
And then when it comes time to write, I just have nothing new to say about it. But my husband likes to joke that I never, ever, ever talk about my novels in progress, but he has a leg up on others because all of a sudden I'll start to get like books in the mail and they'll all be about Robert Garrow, the serial killer from the Adirondacks, or like, and you know, I never say it aloud to him, but he's like, well, I guess she's writing about the Adirondacks hopefully she's writing about the Adirondacks in the 1970s. If not, she's planning something.
I'm going to go with writing. I have friends who are writers, and I'm like, I don't ever want to see your browser history.
No, it's so bad.
I don't ever want to see your, I love you, but I do not ever want to see your
On the
browser
other hand,
history.
it's a very good out for me. I think about that too. An excuse. Sorry.
I can see everyone's wheels turning in the back of the audience. Has your experience in writing and producing Long Bright River for TV series influenced how you visualize your fiction going forward? How has it changed your storytelling?
It hasn't at all. Anything I write that happens to be considered highly adaptable is coincidence. Like what I go for is, you know, fiction is like my bread and butter. First of all, hi guys. I have two representatives from the Long Bright River series who worked with me on the series up until recently, and we're still working together, right? I mean, sure. Yeah, that was was and is a really fascinating experience. I think I will never not write fiction.
Right.
I think of television or film maybe as sort of like icing on the cake. It's something that I've greatly enjoyed doing. I may do it again if I'm lucky enough to have something else made. But fiction is my love, and I'll never write a book just so it can be turned into something else. Right. I am really interested in exploring how to make something on screen as different as possible from the original product, not just for the sake of difference, but just how to make it new and interesting.
Right.
And how to treat it as an entirely different entity, which I think we did in the Long Bright River series as much as we could.
And they are totally different art forms.
Yeah.
I mean, novels are designed, right, for interiority. They're designed to show you the change in time. And you can't, it gets really expensive when you're doing that on the screen.
Does it ever?
In ways that you're just like,
Yeah.
okay, how am I going to pull that off? I want to go back to influences for a second. Obviously, Lehane, French, Edith Wharton. I mean, it's an excellent combination, right? But they can't be all of the influences, because you have done a lot of very different things. So I'm just wondering who are some of the other writers and what are some of the other books that have created Liz Moore, writer that we see now?
Writers who are obsessed with place were some of my early influences. Almost in tandem, because it was both were assigned to me in high school, I read Dubliners and Lost in the City by Edward P. Jones. And
I love that book.
I love it so much.
And
saw them both as books about us, where two different cities were a character as much as anything else. And that struck a chord with me that's never really stopped sounding in my writing. And so I think for that reason, place always comes first. And in my head, I think, well, I have my X book. I won't talk about what the places are, but like I still have this book in me. I still have this book in me based on places in which I have lived experience or a strong emotional connection to. And I'll probably circle back around and, once I've run out of places I have really lived, I'll probably circle back around and start writing another Philadelphia book or another The Unseen. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston, so I don't know. Maybe I'll write my suburban Boston book at some point. I don't know.
There's always space for more Boston books.
Yeah.
And occasionally my Boston slides out, so sorry about that.
Yeah. Where did you grow up exactly?
South Shore.
South Shore,
so
okay.
Whitey Bulger used to disappear people from the parking lot at the A&P.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
I'm really serious about that.
I believe it.
And then there are plenty of people in the current town who are like, what? And I'm like, no, really.
Yeah.
This did actually
Did you
happen.
read Small Mercies?
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
And if you're going to talk about Boston, that is a way to do it. For the people who aren't going to read Common Ground, like, you can hand them Small Mercies and they end up with a not dissimilar experience and possibly one that's better for them. And I'm just like, if fiction can tell the story, great.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly happy to let fiction do
Yeah.
as much of the telling as possible. You also teach, though, right? And you've been teaching for a number of years. Graduate level, right? MFA?
I taught undergrads for years, and I still teach undergrads occasionally at Temple. Now I direct Temple's MFA program.
Okay. So how does your teaching career relate to your writing career?
I love being required professionally to think about contemporary literature and movements in contemporary literature and to see what my students are doing, because there are zeitgeisty things that happen with student writing that speak to what's going on in the culture. And, I won't name them because I feel like that would be doing a disservice to my students who are all trying to individuate themselves in different ways. But like, I can sense all my students being suddenly interested in this writer or this style or producing work that feels like it's in conversation with each other.
Right.
And that's really interesting to me as a writer, just because I kind of like to know what's going on, even if I don't actively participate in it. And also just like thinking about language and words and thinking about why a thing works that a student is doing versus why something doesn't work, and trying to help them get to a place where it does work, I think in return helps me do that with my own writing and treat it with an external editorial gaze in the same way I look at their writing.
It happens too with new booksellers, younger booksellers, where you're just like, you haven't heard of Dennis Lehane. Okay, now I know what's in front of me.
Yeah.
So, like, writers fall in and out of fashion, right? And it's not something you necessarily think about, but, like, there was the Ray Carver era of the short story, right? And then there was the Barry Hannah, however you want to look at it. And now you've got a little more depth and a little more breadth. But I'm like, but Carver still can write, so can we not forget all of the stories? Like, he really did sort of set us up for a moment. And I don't know, it's manga has its place, rock on. Like, story is story, just find the thing that makes you want to engage with narrative, whether it's an audiobook, an ebook, whatever. I just read. Just find the thing. And when I meet people who say, well, I'm not really a big reader, I'm like, you just haven't met the thing. You haven't found the book that's going to turn you into a reader. I swear it exists. I don't always know what it is, but I can help you find it. That's that's the big thing. So when I hear writers who are teaching, I'm like, oh yeah, you guys get to hang out and just muddle your way through, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
It is so great.
Yeah.
So I have a couple more questions here. How would you describe your personal relationship to this book and or the process of creating this book compared to your relationships with your previous books?
This book felt huge in scope by the time I finished writing it. I tend to write long books. They seem to be progressively getting longer and longer.
That's okay.
But Yeah, I mean, this book required a lot of me in terms of keeping track of everything. And so it occupied a large portion of my brain at all times, just in terms of like, how can I make it work? This is the only book that I ever tried and failed to use Scrivener for. Some people in the room who write might use and love Scrivener. I tried it just because there were so many moving parts, and it was nice to be able to like lift chunks around and deposit them elsewhere. It's not for me. I ran the experiment. It doesn't work for me. I use Word. So I guess in that way, it was technically different than some of my other books. It's still like the emotional instincts still feel the same. I have to feel really emotionally engaged by material in order to want to write a book. It takes me about 4 years to write a novel. And so I have to know that I can do it I can be in that world for 4 years. Yeah. Hopefully that answers it.
The jacket on this book, there are fans of this jacket.
Me too. I'm a fan.
It is really, really good. But before I go there, before I forget, I want to ask you about the title, God of the Woods.
Yeah.
Where'd it come from?
I haven't sufficiently developed a good answer for this without disclosing that it wasn't always the title, but I feel good about it, right? We can do that. We're all friends here. I have grown to love the title. I think it's the right title for the book. For a long time, the title of the book was Self-Reliance, which is the name of the house in the book and speaks to a lot of the themes in the novel. But I think we collectively were concerned that maybe it would feel like a self-help book and like it would be miscategorized in a variety of ways. So The God of the Woods came to me pretty late in the process. I spent a lot of time thinking about what could replace Self-Reliance that I would like as much or better. And ultimately, I started going down rabbit holes of looking into the etymology of different words. There's this term wood panic, which I love. And for a second, I was like, could I call it that? But it's the sensation of feeling complete disorientation in the woods, almost irrationally. Like you can be 20 feet from a trail and suddenly feel like I'm completely lost and I'll never be found again because the trees all start to look the same.
Right.
And so then I looked into the etymology of the word panic and discovered that it comes from the Roman god Pan, who was sort of like a trickster and was said to intentionally try to disorient people in the woods. And then I started thinking, well, the God of the Woods actually resonates with me in a lot of ways because the Van Laars, for example, I think of themselves as the gods of these woods in a lot of ways. And also it had a kind of atmospheric quality with a serial killer wandering around in the background. And I felt like he, in a way, was a god of the woods. And like it just, I love titles that have multiple meanings and that can intersect with a lot of different themes. And so that was the winner, ultimately.
It also got us a killer jacket.
Yeah.
It got us a really killer jacket. So the book jacket cover is so beautiful, really sets the tone for the book. How involved with that process were you?
Not very. This is, I think, typical, although I don't know. Maybe I'll sidebar with the Riverhead folks who are here tonight to ask if it is. But in my experience for all 5 books, I have been presented with a cover, and then it is my, I guess, right to say I love this cover or I don't love this cover. And in this case, I was very drawn to this cover right away. I think the only tweaks we made a lot of tweaks to the pink paint, to the placement of the pink paint, to the choreography of the drips, and I think we all ended up being satisfied with the drips.
I'm so super satisfied with this jacket. I mean, I love this jacket because the other thing is too, you want to pick it up and you want to touch it and you want to hang out with whatever is happening. And seriously, I have sent so many copies of this book to people already.
I also like that the pink paint is not immediately obvious as pink paint, so there's discussion around what it actually is. I've heard Pepto-Bismol. I thought it looked a little like a uvula, which some people didn't know the meaning of, and there was a whole weird sidebar about what that means. It's the little punching bag in the back of your throat. And blood is also like, why is the blood pink? But I think it can have lots of different, it looks ominous, which is what it's supposed to look.
It looks totally ominous, but it works.
Yeah, I love it.
It absolutely works. And when you get to the point in the story where is it explained, deeply satisfying. Also, the person who asked that question said they frequently recommend The Unseen World. So,
nice.
Yay. I think, though, because we have so many people here, it's a really good time to start the book signing. So I'm going to say thank you, Liz Moore.
Thank you, Miwa. Really
thank you, Upper
questions.
West Side.
Thank you for coming out on such a hot, disgusting night, too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.